What's going on, Broncos country? Welcome into the Broncos Breakdown. Coming up on today's show, I want to run through ESPN's 53-man roster projection with you guys, run through some of the most notable cuts that they made. Now, before we look at any names, I just want to really open up the video by reminding everyone, unfortunately, injuries do happen. So whenever you see 53-man roster projections and you get really worked up over someone being left off of it, it's a good time to remember that every single year there are unfortunately 1, 2, sometimes even 3 locks to make the roster that go down in the month of August during preseason, and that opens up a spot. We saw that last year, for example, with Tim Patrick. So never get too worked up or in your emotions over your favorite guy who's the 54th player on the roster being snubbed off. Now, let's get to the first cut candidate made by ESPN in their 53-man roster projection. They left off Zach Wilson. And when I say they, it is the Broncos beat reporter Jeff Legwold. So Zach Wilson not making the cut here. I was surprised to see that, and I'll open up by saying I believe Sean Payton is going to put 3 quarterbacks on the 53-man roster. I just feel like with the rookie quarterback potentially starting as soon as week 1, you're going to see a lot of investment in the quarterback room. They're not going to toss Bo Nix out there going for his first year alongside Jarrett Stidham, who's got 4 starts under his belt. I think they're going to want a little bit more experience in that room. So even if Zach Wilson is not viewed as a legitimate chance to start, I think they're going to value him in the quarterback room. Now, have things gone well for Wilson so far? No. But I do believe Sean Payton looks at Zach Wilson as a project, and a project that he wants to undertake and he wants to work on because he sees a lot of the potential in Zach Wilson. So to me, I don't think we're going to see Zach Wilson get cut when we get down to the 53-man roster. I believe there is going to be a home for him in there. Now, before we get any further in the quarterback battle, I just want to remind everyone to share today's video. If you want to get a shout out on a future episode, hit the share button. Send it to a friend, send it to a family member. Once you do that, comment DEN so I can find you in the comment section to give you a shout out. Now, we're only going to do this if we get 25 shares. That's my way of knowing that you're not just commenting DEN without sending it to someone. The record in the month of July for this channel is 16. So let's beat that number by a good margin. Hit the share icon down below. Now, here's what Jeff Legwold wrote in his 53-man roster projection. With Nix expected to be the starter, it is difficult to square the idea the Broncos would spend, quote, weeks, Payton's words, to put together a trade for Wilson and then not keep him on the 53-man roster. But keeping Wilson could cost a team fighting depth issues at other positions a player of greater need. I don't disagree with that train of thought. That's usually why you see teams go with 2 QBs nowadays. But I don't think that Jeff maybe counted correctly to 53. Not that he got to 52, but when looking over his entire roster projection, I noticed he put inside linebacker Drew Sanders on his 53-man. Drew Sanders, ladies and gentlemen, is on the active PUP list. He tore his Achilles, if you recall, back in April training with the team. He's going to stay on the PUP list to start the season. And that's going to knock him out for the first 4 weeks. But the timeline from the start was get him back sometime in October, most likely, which means you're not going to see him in September or the first week of October, most likely. So that's going to open up an extra roster spot for someone like Zach Wilson. So I feel like in writing his own explanation for why he left Wilson off, he kind of revealed that he didn't remember that Drew Sanders is on the PUP list, and the PUP list does not count towards the active 53-man roster. It does count towards the active 90-man roster, but Baron Browning, prime example last year, was on the PUP list. He got knee surgery in the offseason. He missed the first 5 weeks of the season. Then he was elevated, and then he took someone's spot on the roster. But at that point, there's a good chance someone else will probably be injured at that point, so you won't even have to make a roster subtraction. Moving on to the second surprise cut candidate, wide receiver Brandon Johnson. Now, this one's not as big of a surprise in my eyes as Zach Wilson was, given the Denver Broncos recently traded for Wilson, and Payton said they spent weeks on that trade just to cut him a few months later. Unlikely. But Brandon Johnson, I did find surprising. Here are the 6 wide receivers Jeff put on his roster projection. Courtland Sutton, Marvin Mims, Tim Patrick, Lil Jordan Humphrey, Troy Franklin, and Josh Reynolds. Now, if you remember last year, the Broncos did one of two things. They took forever to release their 53-man roster, and they only put 4 wide receivers officially on the initial 53-man roster. Now, once the next day came around and they could move guys to injured reserve, they began making some moves, but for a while, they just ran with 4 wide receivers, and they were calling up guys from the practice squad on Sundays. Now, Sutton, Judy, Mims, and Brandon Johnson were those 4 players. So to see Brandon Johnson be one of the 4 last year and not make it this year was a little bit of a surprise. Then you add in the fact that he had 4 touchdowns last season, which was the second most for all receivers, and it makes it a little bit of a bigger surprise. Now, he was kind of a boomer bust player. He had 4 touchdowns off of 19 receptions. I'm going to go on a limb right now and say that's the highest touchdown percentage per reception across the NFL last year, and maybe even in NFL history, although Jimmy Graham last year had 3 or so touchdowns, and he only had 6 or 7 grabs, so that's probably going to take the cake. Now, to put a bow on the wide receiver portion of the video, who do you think will have more yards in 2024? Sutton or Marvin Mims? Sutton finished last year with about 750-ish yards. Can Marvin Mims surpass that number? I don't think it's out of the question for Marvin Mims to get more yards while Sutton gets more touchdowns. So I'll stick with Courtland Sutton. I'll be a bit chalky. But if you pick Marvin Mims, kudos to you, right? Way to put your nuts in a wheelbarrow. All right, third cut candidate that caught me by surprise. Offensive lineman Sam Mustipher. This one is probably going in order of from most surprising to least surprising, and it's towards the bottom, and I'll explain why in just a second here. But first, I do want to tell everyone watching about our friends over at Game Time. Today's show is sponsored by Game Time. If you love summer baseball and want to catch a Rockies game or any other major league team in your area, you're going to want to give Game Time a shot. Now, something I really like about Game Time are their flash deals. You can save even more with exclusive in-app deals on select games and events ahead of Game Time. Now, plus they also offer the Game Time guarantee. If you find tickets in the same section and row for less, Game Time will credit you 110% of the difference. So take the guesswork out of buying MLB tickets with Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use code CHATSPORTS for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, create an account and redeem code CHAT Sports for $20 off. I put all that information in the comments and description of today's video. Download Game Time today. Last minute tickets, lowest price guaranteed. So going back to Sam Mustipher as a bit of a surprise cut candidate, here were the 9 offensive linemen that Jeff took. You got your 5 starters on the left side, where he has Alex Forsyth, last year's 7th-round pick out of Oregon, who did not appear in a single game last year, keep in mind, starting with the rest of the incumbents. Then you got Luke Wattenberg, Calvin Throckmorton, just an all-time name. That sounds like an extra and kind of looks like an extra from Game of Thrones. Quinn Bailey and Alex Palchevsky, who was a UDFA that made the 53-man last year, but spent much of the year on injured reserve. So the 2 notable cuts that I saw, offensive tackle Matt Peart, someone they signed a few months ago. To me, it signaled, hey, this is our next Cam Fleming, like our next swing tackle that we've got some confidence in stepping in for a game or two if needed. And then Sam Mustipher. Both of these guys have way more experience than pretty much everyone on the bench of the Broncos offensive line put together. I mean, look at Sam Mustipher's career snaps versus Luke Wattenberg and Alex Forsyth. Now, I'm not saying that you have to be the veteran to make the roster. We are seeing a bit of a youth surge from Sean Payton, but I do feel like it's going to be tough for Luke Wattenberg and Alex Forsyth, a 5th and a 7th round draft pick, to prove in just a 5-6 week span during training camp that they are head and heels above Sam Mustipher, and that the Broncos should release the only guy who's got some legitimate experience on the field and not just on special teams. Now, has Sam Mustipher been a great center in this league? No. To be brutally honest with you, he has not. I think the Pro Football Focus grades are a good indication of that. Last year, he filled in a couple of times for the Ravens, but before that, he was a 2-year starter for the Bears. If you know any Bears fans in your life, ask them about Sam Mustipher. and you're probably going to get an unfortunate picture of what to expect. But I do believe that the Broncos are not just going to turn it over to a second or third year player with very little experience just for the sake of, well, we want to go young. No, Sean Payton has been very vocal. They want to get the best 22 guys out there that can help defeat the Seattle Seahawks week 1. So maybe mid-season we notice a switch from Mustipher to a younger player if Sam is struggling and Forsythe is looking good in practice. But I don't think there's going to be enough time in training camp for the young guys to overcome the much more experienced and seasoned player in Mustipher. Fourth player that was excluded from the 53-man is now third-year cornerback Damarri Mathis. Remember him, fourth-round pick out of Pitt. Did not have a good 2023 season. So you might be throwing tomatoes at me going, PD, this is not a surprise. Mathis was cheeks last year. And I'm sorry, Damarri, if you're watching, but they're not wrong necessarily. There were some really bad moments. Here were the 5 cornerbacks, though, that made the roster. Pat Surtain, Jaquan McMillan, Riley Moss, Levi Wallace, Chris Abrams-Drain, the rookie out of Mizzou. All 5 of these guys, in my opinion, are locks to make the roster. So, Damarri Mathis being left off, a big surprise? A little bit. You can look at the stats he had a season ago. They're not good. PFF ranked him 126 out of 127 qualifying corners. He got benched after that Chiefs Thursday night game, if you recall. They turned it over to Fabian Moreau, and then the defense started to get into a bit of a groove. But I still feel like Damarri Mathis being left off for a fourth-round pick just 2 years ago is a little bit of a surprise. Another player that I noticed was not on the list was Trayman Smith. They signed him last offseason to be a special teamer and CB. We didn't see much of him on defense, but we did get a good dose of him on special teams. And I just think with the new kick return rule, we're likely going to see a much more greater emphasis placed on guys that can help out in the return game, which is Trayman Smith. He was pretty much splitting those reps with Marvin Mims on the first day of training camp. So I was a little surprised to see him left off for what he can bring to the special teams game. Fifth and final surprise cut candidate, I'm just going to go with a blanket UDFAs. I know that that might not be a surprise to most people, but Broncos country should know more than anyone else that this is a franchise that takes a lot of pride in their pipeline from being undrafted to the active roster. Just last year alone, Denver had 4 UDFAs make the initial 53-man. Jaleel McLaughlin, Alex Palchevsky, Nate Atkins, Thomas Nkoum. Just in 1 year, 4 guys. And then the year before that, Jalen Virgil. Before that, Andre Mincy. Before that, Isang Bassi, Josh Watson. 2018, we saw Philip Lindsay be the first Pro Bowler to go to the first UDFA to go to the Pro Bowl in his rookie season. A UDFA has made the Broncos' initial 53-man roster 19 times in the last 20 seasons. There is no franchise better than your Denver Broncos at finding hidden gems after the NFL draft. So for not a single one to make this 53-man roster, it's a surprise. All right, summer hot takes for today. It is a toasty day in the Mile High City. It's a dry heat hot take, and you could probably smell this one coming. I think a Broncos UDFA will make the roster. It's happened pretty much every year for 2 decades except for once. So yeah, I don't see that trend ending here. I'll go with Frank Crum, by the way. He's got luscious locks, great flow, from Wyoming, from the area. Go Pokes. So put me down as a believer in Frank Crum to make the 53-man roster. He's an offensive tackle, a priority UDFA signing. I like the dude. I'm pulling for him, and he's my hot take for today.